Folks, a quick disclaimer. The recording has started, and if this call is being recorded and we place our recordings on our YouTube channel, if you are not comfortable with that, you may want to drop off now. Okay. Um, by the way, Allah, can you confirm if you see recording on your end?
Fine, Abid, yes, I do. It's
Okay,
started.
got it. Got it. Thank you. Okay, so here is the quick agenda. So we are going to be talking about Azure Functions and in regards to implementation in large enterprises. And what I mean is enterprises that are heavily regulated, where you have complex security, privacy, and compliance requirement, and how it changes your design, what things you need to think about when you are kind of building your function application. And by the way, this will focus mainly on the network data and identity security architecture. We are not talking about the design patterns. I think if you want to look at the function design pattern, there is very decent documentation on Microsoft sites available where you can find out about different patterns. This is talking about how that reference architecture look like when you have to comply by these certain guidelines. So as we always do, a quick lap around Azure Functions. This is one of the Microsoft serverless platform offering. Um, they are growing by the day, and this is all about function as a service. And to me, this diagram is very useful. As you can see, it starts with an event, which can be an HTTP call. It can be a file dropped in a storage account, which triggers the function, which is a piece of code that is executed, and then in turn output data, like write to a database, put a message in a service bus queue, or things like that. So that's so you have events slash triggers, you have code that is executed, and then you have outputs. So there is an ingress to the function in the form of triggers, which can be HTTP or non-HTTP. There is the execution of the function code where it may need to access some of the services, and then you have the egress to the function, which is writing to other Azure services, all that. So just keep that in mind while we talk about. So here is talk about the enterprise perspective. So when enterprise is looking at um, these services, they based on uh, experience, my experience and my coworkers, these are the things they're concerned about. And just keep in mind, every organization is different. The organization that you may work with or you may be a part of, they may have a different security requirements. So once again, I'm just saying, trying to describe the requirement and the architecture that you put together. So your requirements will be slightly different or maybe a subset of those. So that's why please feel free to ask questions if you have any as we are going through this discussion. So one thing is key is network security. Organizations that are accessing these functions over in their intranet environment, they want to make sure they can access them privately without going over the public internet. At the same time, they want the ability for these functions to access the resources which are living in their virtual network or on-prem over private connectivity as well, without going over the public internet. And one of the big concerns that they have, which is key, is to minimize the risk of data exfiltration. Because so they want what they want to make sure is that there is no unbound egress over HTTP or HTTPS to storage or internet. Because their concern is some bad actor put a piece of code in a function and start sending company data, sensitive company information out to a storage account or somewhere else if that opening is there. So that was, and you will see that dictated our hosting choices as we were planning to host Azure Functions um, for our customers to adopt. Second piece is data protection, and that's where the ability to access any HTTP traffic, basically encrypted in transit, to support TLS. So that's that. And of course, if you are storing any data, it has to be encrypted with customer managed key. So that's one of the other requirement. And they wanted to use managed identity as much as possible. The customers are not a big fan of service principal because it needs a lot of management overhead, though managed identities are kind of a lightweight service principal, but still, you don't have to do any have a management overhead with it. And they really help you in resolving kind of the access issue, and make it clean where you once the resource is gone, its managed identity is gone, and you don't have to do any cleanup afterwards, a service principal cleanup. So based on those service requirements, or enterprise requirement, here is what feature we decided to use to kind of provide to comply with that particular requirement. For example, in order to access, for example, if you want to access a function over HTTP private endpoint, you want to access over HTTP privately, you use private endpoint. So that was the feature. Um, and believe it or not, a number of enterprise customer uh, fun, they started adapting functions when this feature came along. That was very so key to them. Second thing is, for non-HTTP trigger, just keep in mind, now you have the ability with function to for non-HTTP trigger to be called over private connectivity. That wasn't there in the past. So that's another thing. And then ability to do to access resources in a VNet, that's been there for some time. Virtual network integration, and um, the ability to lock the subnet where VNet is function is integrated, and blocking all the traffic so there is no data exfiltration. Uh, that was one of the key requirement, and that's why a number of I know some of the customers that I worked with, they went with Azure Function Premium plan and decided not to go with ACE V1 or V2. So if you don't know ACE, I mean App Service Environment. App Service Environment is a VNet injected service. It provides a number of the capabilities that we discussed. Like for example, private endpoint. It has a private IP address that gives you that you can access the services. Especially I think ACE V2. It is in a VNet, so you can access other services in the VNet or on-prem if that VNet is connected to on-prem. But at the same time, it it is it requires you to open outbound ports to storage and internet, because the reason is it is howling the management traffic for the ACE app service environment on customer VNet, and that was a no-no for a number of customers, and some of the customers that I worked with. That's why they waited till ACE v3 came in, because that was a big change in ACE v3 where it has a split horizon model where the traffic uh, it's taking the any management traffic on a separate VNet. It's not taking it on um, the customer VNet. Any questions so far?
Nothing in the
Okay.
chat, Naveed, but folks, feel free to put Your questions on the chat, happy to read them to Naveed if you don't want to go off mute.
Thank you, Allah. Thank you, Owen. Okay, so let's move on. So that's the networking requirement, and that was the key, and that's why I have this. Yes. So as you can see here, um, those are the three hosting options that have been used with some of the customers that I have worked with, and they started with premium function plan. Some of the apps which were already using app service, they decided to host their function in app service as well to save cost in same app service plan. And some of them are now taking advantage of ASV3 for obvious capability of a service plan with a very large number of instances, app service plan instances. So with that, so just and there is no use of ASV1 and V2 as we talk about it because of the data exfiltration concern. So once again, as I said, based on the security, privacy, and compliance requirement that is kind of shaping the design decision to come. Okay. In regards to, so let's come to the data protection. So we all know that function TLS 1.2 support is there for Azure Functions. So that's all good there. That's how, you know, we are able to cover that particular feature requirement. And then we have what they required was that any data that is stored by any service has to be encrypted by customer managed key, or if they are secret, they are stored into Key Vault. And that's where Azure Key Vault references comes into picture, because if there are any secrets that are part of the configuration, they are stored in a Key Vault securely and access it at runtime from the app, and that makes uh, uh, customer really at ease with that. And finally, as I said before, they want to make sure managed identity is front and center. And as you know, Azure Function is continuously adding support for inbound and outbound trigger and ability to call those services through managed identity. So that's that. Okay. So here is the architecture that we put together for a intranet facing app only. So this is an app that is accessed only over the internet internally in an organization. This is a function app. As you can see here on the right hand side, um, there are two storage accounts. Function storage account is the storage account which is storing the function metadata. And as you can see, there are private endpoints that are connected for file, blob to access that metadata, and everything is over private endpoint. This function storage account, it blocked off from the internet, so it cannot be accessed for the public internet. Okay, can only be accessed through private endpoint. Then we have the app storage, which is basically kind of in this demo, I'm using a blob trigger, and that's a part of it. So that's where its access is also through private endpoint. Okay. And then we have Key Vault, where all the Key Vault references are stored. And that access is also driven through a private endpoint. So once again, Key Vault is also blocked off from the um, internet. Okay. Um, and then we have the if we kind of and all access to those services like Key Vault, like storage, is driven through managed identity. So there are no issue of storing SaaS signatures and things like that. Any app that is accessing a function consumer that are on-prem trying to access the function, they are accessing it through a private endpoint and through a VPN or access route. So any questions on this one?
Just a quick question. The Key Vault, is that a separate instance or is it part of like the built-in function? It's just a
No, no,
separate
no.
instance of
Key
Key
Vault,
Vault, right?
yes, exactly. Key Vault
Okay, okay.
is Key Vault is definitely a separate service, and I'm just using as an example. So there may
Okay,
be
got
another
it.
service like a SQL database,
Yeah,
So if you want to write to it, you will have to create a private endpoint to it. So there is no public
got it.
access of
Okay,
that.
thank you.
Okay, now let's look another one. This is where you have, I'm not sure why this annoying thing is on top, but let's wait if it goes away. Um, okay, so as you can see here, it is an intranet and internet facing function. So this function is need to be accessed both internally and externally, inside the organization and outside. But the challenge with function and app service, I'm sure you know, if you create a private endpoint, it can no longer be accessed over public internet. Okay. So that's why if you see here, the internal access is the same. For external access, I'm using a front door premium because front door premium is the only service from the front door family that can connect to a private endpoint. At the moment, it supports function, app service, storage, Kubernetes, and internal load balancer based private endpoints. Okay, so as you can see here, it is connecting to the private endpoint. So you have your Azure function exposed externally as well as internally uh, in a secure way. Nothing is changed on the function storage side or app storage side. Okay. Any questions on this one? Okay, let me move further. Okay, so this is an internet facing application where you're only accessing it over the internet. In that case, you don't see a function private endpoint because it's a public. What we are doing is we are locking or blocking access to the function using the function firewall with FD service tag and FDID. So there is this front door service tag will make sure that any traffic that is coming to the function firewall to the function is coming from a front door instance. But what that means is any front door instance will be able to send traffic to it. Maybe somebody created by a bad actor. And the next step is what you do is you put the front door ID. You look for the front door ID header. And once you have that there, then it is to ensure that the traffic is only coming to that particular front door that you are using. Any questions?
Just a comment.
Mhm.
You can also front it with App Gateway with the APIM in between, right?
Absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely. And actually, that's a great point. That is one of
that's
the
kind of what we're doing right now.
yeah, no, exactly. I mean, so there are teams in working with a customer. They are using that where they are using App Gateway and APIM. So there are multiple ways, but I'm just describing some of the cases that I have seen. So yes, absolutely, that is a very valid use case. But the point is, uh, I mean, the point I want to bring home is everything is locked off, no access from the internet, and only access through private endpoints. Okay, but is this the best architecture? And once again, I just want to make sure everybody gets this message. There is no best architecture. Whatever architecture you come up with that meets your customer requirement is the architecture that you go with. You know, because this architecture may be working with a customer that I'm working with. It may not work with your customer. And that's why I have this reference architecture, total cost of ownership. Just keep in mind, nothing is for free. You have to pay, especially in the cloud, you have to pay for everything. For example, as you have seen on the last slide, this architecture is heavily dependent on private endpoints back and forth. You know, there are connection from there are a number of, I mean, we just saw that almost like 6, 7, 8 private endpoints just on this app. Okay. Though the cost of private endpoint is low, 1 cent per endpoint, but there is a 1 cent per GB cost as well of data. And just keep in mind, this is not the normally you pay bandwidth cost when your data leave an Azure region. In this case, you will be paying cost even though your data may be in the same region. For example, you are um, your function is processing some data from a storage account, large number of images, and is kind of extracting them and then accessing, pushing them to, or maybe extracting text or whatever, and pushing it to a database. So now that traffic, it's all within the region, but since if you are going through private endpoints, you will be paying that 1 cent per GB tax. Just keep that in mind. And as you have a lot of data, you have a lot of private endpoint, this cost will add up. Okay. And just keep in mind, if your organization is okay with it, that's fine. I mean, if they want to pay the security tax, that's okay. But there are other ways to address it if they are okay going with it, like service endpoints. For example, where we have, if you, in the last diagram, where we have the private endpoint to the storage, we could have easily used service endpoints. There's no cost to it. They're free. And so you won't have to pay this private endpoint security tax. Okay. And then where you have functions, you can take advantage of IP firewall, and that way you can secure it. I know some organizations, they have public facing function instead of private endpoint. They decided to go, whitelist to or allow list to the IP addresses of their organization, like outbound IP addresses, to make sure that traffic is only coming from their organization. So that's another way of doing it. But once again, permitting your organization allows that. Okay.
There's a follow-up on the use case, the APIM and app gateway. Was that only valid for internet-facing scenarios?
Yeah, that would be valid for internet facing scenario mostly. I mean, you can have it for internet facing scenario as well. But in that case, you will have to use a premium APIM instance, which is VNet injected, and yeah, that can probably. But in that case, I'm not sure if I will use an app gateway in the middle. I will just use function as a backend of APIM. If it is internal only, just keep in mind. If it is external, then yes, app gateway has to be there in front of APIM. I hope that answered that question. And one last point to it, private endpoints do tend to make the architecture more complex and hard to troubleshoot because now you have point-to-point connectivity, and I have seen a number of times, um, you know, a missing private DNS zone or entry in a private DNS zone breaks the architecture. I mean, breaks the application, and then you have to troubleshoot. Um, and uh, and for example, if you want to access the Kudu console, make sure you have a private endpoint to the Kudu console as well. I mean, you get that, but you have to add the DNS entry. And some customers that I have worked with, they forgot to include that entry. For example, you have an entry for function, and then you have to have an entry for SCM dot whatever your function name is. That entry has to be there in your DNS so you can access the Kudu console. Otherwise, you will not be able to access the Kudu application from your portal. It will get access denied. Okay. So with that, just a kind of a quick demo. So here is the um, here is the app and that I have. Let me go in here. This is kind of the overall infrastructure that I have deployed. And as you can see in the function app, this is um, only accessible by these other three functions. Let me go into the networking. And as you can see here, it is only using private endpoints for connectivity. And let's take you to the particular VNet. Where is the virtual network? This is the virtual network, and these are the two subnets. So app subnet is where the function is integrated. And as you can see, I have an NSG over there. And remember the talk, something I mentioned about data exfiltration. As you can see, all internet outbound is blocked. It's only allowing Azure Active Directory outbound for since it's using managed service identity. Okay, that's how you can unblock services one by one instead of just blindly opening it to internet. So that's the kind of uh, that's what they're using to secure uh, outbound and to reduce the risk of data exfiltration. Okay. And for example, if I try to access this service from here, so I have this service, as you can see, this is the function. I'm getting this address, web app data unavailable. This is IP forbidden. Yes, of course, because I'm trying to access it from outside. I can't access it. But I have also exposed this service, as you saw in the diagram, over front door. So if I try to access that, you will see a response back. As you can see, that is successful. And once again, I have this VM that is sitting in the same VNet where my uh, where I have drop a private endpoint to the app function. So yes, I can access it. So all of that is happening. Uh, and I wanted to show you one last thing. And if we go into the um, storage account, where is that? I know you're right on time. So as you can see, all the storage account, just want to show it to you. There is no access from the internet, public access. Everything is through private endpoint, and this is the IP address of my outbound router. So I allow it, but all the rest of the access is blocked. Okay. So with that, any questions? I know we are kind of.
I just had a question.
Yes.
So as you saw the diagram, it's pretty complex. There's lots of DNS zones. There's app service plan. Lots of private endpoints.
Yeah.
Why is it so difficult to deploy? Like, why can't you select, you know, I want it private and it automatically deploys the backend
No, that's a very good
configuration,
point. I think,
right?
I mean, and that's where, is it Jay?
Yes.
Yeah, Jay, the thing is, that's where your um, kind of a CI/CD pipeline will come in.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
yes, I mean, yeah, you do it for the first time, probably
Yeah.
make sure everything looks okay, then go with Terraform or
Yeah.
Bicep or ARM, and that's it. I mean, you have now what we call it like a cookie cutter, and that's
Right. A
just
module.
start creating cookies.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it's kind of what I did. So I'm using Terraform and I wrote a module for it, but it took a while to get
I
everything to
know,
work properly. Yeah.
I know. I mean, and
If
that's
if it's okay, I could share the module chat.
yeah, please,
All right.
definitely.
Thanks. Thank you. This was really helpful.
Thank you, folks. Any other question, folks? I know we are a bit over time. Sorry for not being.
The chat is good, Naveed, discussions, but I believe the questions there were unanswered. So
Okay, great. Thank you. And I hope everybody had a wonderful weekend and stay safe. And hope to see everybody next week for another session of Azure Power Lunch.